I know what you're thinking. This is a topic that has been covered a ton, but I've never seen someone actually explain why you should write actively instead of passively. I want to review concepts that you're probably familiar with, like active versus passive voice. But then I want to explain why active is usually better, not just tell you to do it. I remember my teachers in school always said, don't use the passive voice, which is a fine heuristic, but I think heuristics are more valuable when you understand their nuance. Growing up, when I asked why should I use the active voice, the only answer I ever received was active voice is more assertive, which is good. That's not always true, and it's not even the best reason to use active voice. The most important reasons to write active prose are clarity and flow. Writing active prose cuts down on needless words and confusing phrasing. I want to explain to you how these tips actually accomplish that, so you understand how to use them. Before I jump into this list though, I use the term active outside its standard usage. Active voice and passive voice have very strict definitions, but you can apply their fundamental ideas outside of their standard usage. You'll see what I mean.
Tip number 1, identify and use active voice.
Like I said, passive voice tends to get piled onto by editors and teachers since new writers tend to overuse it. But to be clear, it isn't inherently bad. It has its use cases. The issue comes when it makes things wordier and clumsy. But first, what is it exactly? Passive voice is when the object of the verb is foregrounded, meaning it comes at the beginning of the sentence and looks like it's the subject. For example, the hammer was swung by Levi. The hammer is actually the direct object in this case, while Levi, me, is the noun, the subject of the sentence. Now let's rearrange that to the active voice, where the subject is properly foregrounded. Levi swung the hammer. Now let's break this down into parts so we can understand how these voices work and how to easily identify them. Levi is the subject since he is performing the action. Swung is the verb since it's the action that's taking place, and the hammer is the direct object since it is receiving the action. You can easily find the direct object by asking the question subject verb plus what? Levi swung what? The hammer. That's your direct object. That's a clear answer that's a noun, and you don't get that if you use the passive voice. For example, if we go back to the hammer was swung by Levi, then we ask the question, the hammer was what? Well, it was swung. In this case, the answer is a verb, and verbs can't be direct objects, usually. Direct objects tend to be nouns, and this formation is a good sign that you're using passive voice. To make it a little bit easier, you can usually find the direct object by doing subject, verb, direct object. This is the order things should be in, usually, and you will see it like this most of the time. I eat breakfast. I am hungry. While passive voice will switch these two around to make the sentence more convoluted. It's important to remember that gerunds, which are verbs ending in ing, and infinitive phrases, verbs preceded by to, can act as nouns and therefore a direct object. But if one of these is your direct object, there's a good chance you are still using passive voice. Sometimes you can bury your verb in an infinitive phrase, which obscures the sentence even more. The winner is to be decided by me. To be decided is the infinitive phrase here. I am the actual subject of the sentence. Decide is the verb, and the winner is the direct object. We can rewrite this as I will decide the winner. I is the subject, will decide is the verb in future tense, and the winner is the direct object. I will decide what? The winner. So why is passive voice bad? Well, you can see from our examples, it makes sentences needlessly wordy. In that previous example, the passive voice nearly doubles the length of the sentence. Generally speaking, sentences should only have as many words as they need to convey their meaning. We want to trim anything unnecessary so long as it doesn't harm the flow or clarity. The most important argument against passive voice, in my opinion though, is that it makes action confusing. And I don't mean the genre, I mean the words on the page that aren't description or dialogue. Let's dive deeper into why passive voice hurts action in tip number 2.
Tip number 2, write things in the order they happen.
This creates a sentence structure that's easy to comprehend. When you put the direct object at the beginning of the sentence, like in passive voice, that's where the reader's focus starts. Let's reimagine that original sentence in video form so we can see how the focus changes. The hammer was swung by Levi. You don't have the full picture until the very end of the sentence. It makes much more sense to start wide and then move in. Levi swung the hammer. That's less wordy with a more logical flow of information. But there's other ways to confuse the flow of action that aren't just passive voice though. For example, some writers will explain why something happened after the fact. Levi fell to the ground after being punched by Cole. Levi fell to the ground is active voice, but it's followed by action that should have preceded it. It could be reconstructed as Cole punched Levi and he fell to the ground. In that example, the action is more coherent since it's presented in the correct order, and this drastically improves the flow of your prose. Making the reader recontextualize what they've already read makes them pause to reconstruct the details. You don't want the reader's eyes to stop. That ruins the flow and momentum of the scene.
Tip number 3, establish relevant details before they become necessary.
This is where things get more complex. All of these tips boil down to arranging your action and details in a logical order to increase readability. With passive voice, that's a matter of flipping around the sentence structure. With strict action, it's a matter of putting things in chronological order. But sometimes this will be harder than rearranging a sentence or two when you start adding things like description. For example, try not to explain a character's mental state or intentions after they take an action. It should be obvious in the moment. Levi rolled to the side to dodge, but ran into the wall, still disoriented and blinded from Cole's last blow. Ideally, we should understand that Levi is disoriented before he hits the wall. That way the audience knows why that happened. In this case, you can just rearrange the sentence to help improve its flow. Still disoriented and blinded from Cole's last blow, Levi rolled to the side to dodge, but ran into the wall. That's better, but still not perfect though. That dependent clause at the beginning of the sentence is clunky and takes a long pause from the action. Presumably, the audience just saw Cole punch Levi, so they probably understand why he feels that way already. Plus, this option tells you how Levi feels instead of pulling you into the scene. Let's try one more time. Levi's head swam and his vision went blurry. A fuzzy shadow loomed over him, arm cocked back, ready to punch. Levi rolled to the side, but ran into the wall. In that example, you can see how things really start to come to life when you plant details earlier instead of injecting them right when they become relevant. The audience understands that Levi is frazzled, and that's why he accidentally runs into the wall. In my first rewrite, if this happens in the middle of action, it will slow the progress some, since it isn't actually action, it's an interjection of description. But the second example pulls you into the action in real time. You experience what's happening along with Levi, rather than being told about it. Notice how I describe Cole in this example too. A fuzzy shadow loomed over him. If you were in Levi's place, that's the first thing you would see, a large object above you. And then you'd notice the arm. Describing things in a natural order helps pull the reader into a scene and comprehend what's happening.
Tip number 4, break the rules.
Notice that I do tell a little bit in my final example from tip number 3, when I say ready to punch. That's probably already clear to the audience before they read it, so I could cut it. I don't have to though. I like the effect it gives the sentence. It breaks it into 3 parts and increases the drama as we move from left to right. I don't think you get the same effect without it. That moment of telling also functions as a pause in the middle of the action without deliberately saying that there was a pause. If you are someone who likes to write super clean and fast-paced action, you would probably omit ready to punch. But I kind of like the cartoonish drama it adds to the moment. It fits what I'm going for. And at the end of the day, that's what matters. It's not about always using active voice or always showing rather than telling. It's about knowing how to use these things to achieve a goal. That's what this is all about. Writing in active voice is about putting what's important first and giving your sentences logical order. And that concept is why all of these tips make for active prose. Writing in active voice, putting your action in order, and establishing details before they're relevant give you the power to control the flow and pace of your prose. A passive writer who isn't paying attention to these things has almost no control over the flow and pace of their story. I don't want you to be flying blind while you're writing. I want you to make choices about when to speed things up and when to slow them down. Don't let passive prose control your story. The deliberate choice to break from standard practice is one of the places where style is born. These rules and guidelines are meant to increase the clarity of your work so your style can shine. Writing in passive voice or active voice isn't style. The way you choose to control the flow and pacing of your action is, though. There's a quote, often attributed to Pablo Picasso, that's cliched by this point, but it's cliched because it's true. Learn the rules like a pro so you can break them like an artist. And as always, there are no real rules. Write what you want and have fun. Thanks for watching.
C'est fini.
Hey, thanks again for watching this video. Make sure you like and subscribe. I know this is a little bit different from what we usually do on this channel, but I thought it would be nice to return to some of the basics about writing. But if you thought it was boring, if you don't like grammar or whatever, don't worry, we'll get back to the conceptual stuff soon. But seriously, if this video had new ideas to you, I definitely recommend sitting down and taking a paragraph that you've written, or that you haven't written, it can just be any paragraph, and editing it into passive or active voice along the way, and then reading it out loud to see how the voices change the flow. Anyways, I just thought that it would be nice to talk about. And it's been good seeing you, and I'll see you later.